So I'm here at Oak Hill Cemetery, and I have decided to start a whole new series on Oak Hill and several other cemeteries here in Calhoun County. And I started with a book called A Biographical Review of Calhoun County. And I took all of the names that they had indexed in there, and they have biographies on all of these people, and I put their names in a spreadsheet, and in the spreadsheet I plugged in where every one of them was buried in Calhoun County that I could find. And I was able to find probably about 98% of them. A large portion of them are buried right here in Oak Hill Cemetery. So I thought it would be best to start here and give you some of the biographies that are in this cemetery. I intend to do a series of videos on this, and I'm going to cover the other cemeteries in this whole area as well, and in the county. So come along and join me. This is the first in the series, and I hope you'll enjoy it. All of the stories in this video series are taken in part from a book published in 1904 by Hobart and Mather from Chicago called Biographical Review of Calhoun County. The book, as it describes, contains historical, biographical, and genealogical sketches of many of the prominent citizens that were alive during its publication, as well as some from the past. I took time to create an Excel spreadsheet of all of the names in this book and included the locations of where they're buried so that when I create future videos, I could use this information. And during the process, I made some interesting discoveries in doing this project. There's a total of 375 individual biographies in this book, and I was able to locate about 98% of the cemeteries they're buried in. The lion's share of the names in this book are buried in Oak Hill Cemetery. And in second place is Oak Ridge Cemetery in Marshall, and in third is Riverside Cemetery in Albion. The rest are spread out through various cemeteries in Calhoun County. There are approximately 10% that are buried in other parts of Michigan or in other parts of the country. Of interesting note, the book leaves out a lot of names one might come to expect to be automatically included in such a compilation of biographies. For example, there's no biography on James and Ellen White, Sojourner Truth, W.K. Kellogg, John Harvey Kellogg from Battle Creek, or Sidney Ketchum from Marshall. Also, there are only 3 or 4 biographies in the entire book of women. At first glance, one might consider these omissions to make this book seriously incomplete, and there is truth in that consideration. However, the book contains biographies on people who lived in the county that I have found referenced nowhere else. So in that way, it's an absolute treasure. But there were other biographical collections published around the same time, which did include these other famous figures. So it's possible that they were trying to cover ground that no other book of the period had covered. Whatever the reason, the end result is a collection of marvelous forgotten stories of Calhoun County's past. I will also include other material, when available, from other sources on the people in this series to give you the best picture that I can on who they were and their accomplishments. I shall begin with the seemingly impossible task of trying to convey the magnitude of the amazing life of Walter Water Woolno, who died in 1904 and left a vast chasm of emptiness within the Battle Creek community when he passed. He was born in Bungay, Suffolk County, England, in July of 1812. He arrived in America with his parents when he was 11 years old, and they settled in New York. As he grew up, he acquired the knowledge of the art of printing in Rochester, New York, working as an apprentice. In 1842, at the close of his apprenticeship, he began to move west seeking work in his field and became a foreman in the office of the Ashtabula, Ohio Sentinel. The Sentinel was a vigorous anti-slavery Whig newspaper, and it was during this time that he imbibed ideas concerning the rights of man, which controlled his political action in the future. In 1843, he married Emmeline Dorcas Manley of Ashtabula, Ohio, who was considered by many to be a woman of culture and refinement. Together, they would have 4 daughters. In 1845, Woolno continued his journey west with his wife with the ambitions to go into business for himself. He settled in Battle Creek and started the very first newspaper in the city, entitled The Western Citizen. In 1846, he became editor and publisher of the Michigan Tribune, which only lasted 2 years as it struggled for patronage knowledge, it being one of the most zealous anti-slavery Whig journals published in the West. In 1852, Mr. Woolno became editor and publisher of the Battle Creek Journal, which had been started the previous year. It grew to become one of the leading publications in the area. He sold the paper in 1863 and rested for a time. Mr. Woolno later served as an alderman for the city for 4 years and also had a term in the state legislature. He also served on the Board of Education for 9 years, as well as a period of time as Justice of the Peace. He began his political life as a Whig and in later years joined the Republican Party when the organization formed because of his anti-slavery sentiments. In fact, the first steps in the formation of the Republican Party were taken at meetings held in his office in early 1854, with himself acting as chairman. The resolutions that were adopted at those meetings were ultimately ratified at a mass meeting held under the Oaks in Jackson, Michigan on July 6, 1854. Mr. Woolno was one of 60 delegates alongside Erastus Hussey. He remained in the newspaper business through the Civil War until 1864, when the governor of Michigan requested that he go to City Point, Virginia, in the company of 2 physicians to assist in the taking care of wounded and remained there for the allotted time. In 1871, he became a part owner and editor of a Second Michigan Tribune, where he remained active for 7 years, eventually selling out to his partner in 1878. For a brief time, he invested in Kansas farming land with the intentions of moving to the state and taking up farming. This lasted very briefly, and he sold his land and returned to Battle Creek within a few years. In 1883, he joined up with the Battle Creek Daily Moon and became a political and editorial writer and remained with them for 20 years. His wife Emmeline would pass away in 1899. The Saturday before his own death, he prepared his usual column and turned it into the newspaper, not having missed a deadline in years. In the final months before his passing, he had found it difficult to be at the office of the newspaper, so he had worked at home, and workers at the paper would come to retrieve his columns. He was described as an old-style editor in his early days, where he could walk up to the case with his editorial thoughts in mind, assemble the type on the printing press without ever needing to write it down with pen and paper. He operated that way for many years until his health failed him. It appears he suffered from a stroke at his home in front of his family and passed away on February 2nd, 1904, at the age of 82. In the days after his passing, there were many large articles in the newspaper of the time praising him. One letter to the editor described him when he was at his zenith in the newspaper wars of the time, battling it out with other papers from Kalamazoo to Marshall. It was a time when many other smaller papers were headed by quote-unquote scoundrels, and some were even referred to as traitors of the country. Walter Woolno was described in this letter as, "Editor Woolno always had his cudgel ready with the rest, and he knew how to use it. Among others, Seth Lewis of the Marshall Statesman often felt its weight. In the early day, the only eating house on the line of the Michigan Central was located in Marshall, and the road also had extensive repair shops there. The now sleepy burg was ahead of Jackson, Kalamazoo, or Battle Creek in importance as a railroad town, and was particularly the envy of Mr. Woolno's borough, which was rated as only an ordinary village. Consequently, there was always more or less clashing between the two places, which found expression in their newspapers. Half the time, the fist of the Battle Creek Journal, Woolno's paper, was belaboring the nasal organ of the Statesman. In fact, these neighboring towns and their papers are hardly on speaking terms at present day." An ex-justice of the Supreme Court also wrote a praising letter of Walter Woolno in the same edition on February 8th. He had known him for 58 years, stating, "He never pretended to be better than he was, and yet his moral life was a pattern. In the domain of opinion, he was superbly independent and possessed the courage of his convictions. He was rich in common sense and in the range of knowledge needed to equip one for the management of a country newspaper in a Michigan town of high ideals." His funeral service was held at his home on North Avenue in a private ceremony, and he was buried in his family plot at Oak Hill Cemetery. George Sackett Barnes was born in March 1867 in Rochester, New York. When he was 3 years old, he moved with his parents to Battle Creek. Shortly after their arrival, his mother passed away. His father left him with his uncle and aunt and returned to New York. Shortly thereafter, he succumbed to tuberculosis. Thus, George was brought up by his uncle and aunt in Battle Creek, living off of Green Street. He attended school until age 16, when he was obliged to quit and learn a trade. He went to Reed City, where another uncle was publishing a newspaper, and there he learned the skills and trade of a printer. He returned after his apprenticeship and worked as a printer for the Daily Moon and later the Sunday Morning Call. In 1885, George Barnes saw an opportunity along a subject line that he was interested in: the raising and breeding of poultry. With an associate, he started the Michigan Poultry Breeder magazine, while he continued to work nights for the Sunday Morning Call. He published his first edition and sent it out for free to prospective readers in hopes of selling a subscription in future editions. It began as an 8-page paper and then grew to 24 pages. He began to sell subscriptions all over the country, selling to every state in the Union. Soon, he was selling thousands of copies monthly. In 1888, he was able to buy the Game Fancier's Journal and transferred it to Battle Creek. For some time, he maintained an office on Jackson Street in downtown, but later bought a home on Maple Street, now Capitol Avenue Northwest, and erected a building for his magazine at the rear of his home. The magazine was a success, and Mr. Barnes gained a considerable practical knowledge of raising fine poultry. Many times he exhibited his chickens at shows and won many prizes. He gained blue ribbons in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and in New York. He used his knowledge to run his magazine, and it soon grew into a large, profitable enterprise. He began to invest his income in real estate and owning the 6-acre farm off Maple Street and another 43-acre farm just outside of the city. He married Miss Fannie Webb in December 1890, who was the sister of Mayor Frank Webb, whom I'll be featuring later in this video. Fannie had grown up in Battle Creek, and in her youth had learned typesetting at the Battle Creek Journal. Together they would have only one daughter, who would pass away in 1912. George would serve as alderman for the city for 4 years, and also serve as a chairman for the committees on the police department, printing, and also the sidewalks and crosswalks. He was instrumental in removing politics from the police department, and he was also responsible for establishing a system of the first paved sidewalks in the city. He would also go on to serve as mayor of Battle Creek and later county treasurer. He was regarded as a far-seeing businessman who illustrated success in faithful, continued effort in carrying out an honest purpose. He was considered to be a successful man who was full of integrity, activity, and energy, and had gained a creditable position within the community. He was liked and admired as plain George Barnes, who, although despite his many offices he held in the city, his attitude towards those he knew never changed. This made him a real power in politics, though he never was willing to cash in on his popularity or use his friendships for political purposes. Instead, he was noted for his geniality and heartiness and always laughing with his friends. In November of 1923, he began to be afflicted with heart and kidney ailments, which he suffered badly during the winter months. His condition grew worse, and he was unable to lie down due to shortness of breath, and he slept in an easy chair in his home. When he passed away in May of 1925 at the age of 58, his funeral contained a large crowd at his home on Maple Street, drawing people from both the city and county governments, as well as friends from Marshall, Kalamazoo, and Battle Creek, and other surrounding towns. He's buried in the same plot of another mayor, Fred Webb, his brother-in-law. Fred H. Webb was born in Battle Creek in May of 1854, and his parents were Caleb and Sarah Webb, both natives of Oxfordshire, England.
They had arrived in Battle Creek in 1853, and Caleb served as a sexton for Oak Hill Cemetery for many years. Fred was the oldest of 7 children, and he attended school in Battle Creek until 1870, when he then worked as a farmhand for about 2 years. In October of 1872, he entered the employ of the Nichols and Shepherd Company, where he would ultimately work for most of his adult life. Over the years with Nichols and Shepherd, he started out in the wood shop and then advanced to timekeeper, and in 1888 he was promoted to paymaster in charge of the payroll for 575 employees. In October 1872, he joined the Tempest Hand Engine Company No. 2, and later he organized the Gogwak Hook and Ladder Company. He served with or was connected in some way with the city as a volunteer fireman for 30 years. In 1894, he was appointed in the role of Assistant City Fire Chief and served in that role until 1904. He married Carola V. Babcock in June of 1874, and together they would have 1 daughter. Mr. Webb was first elected as a member of the City Council in 1893, and he was re-elected in 1895. He then took a 2-year absence and returned to be elected again in 1899 and 1901. He resigned in 1902 to become mayor and was re-elected to that position in 1903. Following his retirement from the mayor's office, he was appointed in 1905 as a member of the Board of Public Works of the city to Mayor George Barnes, his brother-in-law. He later became a member of the Oak Hill Cemetery Board, a position that he would hold until he died. He retired from Nichols and Shepherd in 1924. Barnes and Webb were neighbors on Maple Street, and Fred Webb died 3 months after George Barnes in 1925. He had been ill for several months and had undergone 2 different operations at the sanitarium in the month of July. He was convalescing at his home when he died in August. The Barnes and Webb family share a common, massive stone monument at Oak Hill Cemetery in a combined plot. It is one of the most prominent ones near the front entrance of the cemetery, opposite the C.W. Post Mausoleum. Dr. Austin White Alvard was born in Chester, Massachusetts in February 1838. His family descended from the early Pilgrims who arrived in the country at Plymouth Rock in 1635. At the age of 14, he entered college in Vermont and later in Oberlin, Ohio. During his junior year, he left Oberlin and entered the literary department at the University of Michigan, where he achieved a Master's of Arts degree. Upon completing his degree, he engaged in teaching in Iowa and later in Owego, New York, until the outbreak of the Civil War. Responding to the call of men to service, he enlisted in Company H, the 109th New York Infantry, and went to the front as a captain, and many of his former students going with him, forming the company. They went into Camp Bingham, New York, and from there proceeded to Washington, where he engaged in guarding of the railroad for some time. They later became part of the 9th Army of the Potomac and participated in many of the campaigns up through Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Early in 1864, he was promoted to Chief Quartermaster of the Department of the South and on the staff of General Foster for headquarters at Hilton Head and Beaumont, South Carolina. He acted as a surgeon during the greater part of the closing of the Civil War and was one of the only 2 surgeons from Michigan to do so during the war without a medical license. Though he had not graduated, he had spent 2 years as a student in the medical department at the University of Michigan, and during the war, that was enough experience to enter him into that position of a surgeon. He was finally discharged in October 1864 because he had gone into failed health and his superiors did not feel he could stand the continued strain of his duties in the Army. Following his discharge from the military, he completed his course in medicine and was graduated from the class of 1868 in the medical department at the University of Michigan. He first established an office in Clinton, Michigan, and was there practicing as a doctor until 1882. when in order to avoid the duties of a large country practice, he came to Battle Creek. He soon became recognized as a leading physician and surgeon in the city and engaged in a general practice. He later became president of the Calhoun County Medical Society and later the State of Michigan Medical Society. In 1899, he was appointed by the governor to the first state board of registration on medical practitioners in Michigan. He later served as chairman of the Committee on Colleges and Standards in Michigan. He also was a surgeon at the Nichols Memorial Hospital in Battle Creek for many years. He married Eliza Barnes of Ann Arbor in 1861, and she would pass away in 1877, leaving him with 2 children. He would marry again to Fanny Ruth Little in 1878, and she passed away in 1901, leaving him also with 2 children. He married a third time to Addie Sophia Moore in 1902. Dr. Alvard was known in the community for his benevolent spirit and charity and generosity as a professional. He was a leading representative of his profession in the state of Michigan and held a high social prominence within the community. He passed away in March of 1915 at the age of 77 in St. Petersburg, Florida, where in his later years he had begun to winter there and developed a large medical practice. Dr. Alvard was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery and has a very impressive monument. Franklin Pittman was born in Pontiac, Michigan in November 1852. His father was a former clothing merchant in that city and had been born in England in 1811. And when he was a young man, he had come to America and settled in New York. He later moved to Michigan, where his son was born. He named him Franklin because he was born on the day that Franklin Pierce was elected president. Pontiac was where Franklin grew up and was educated. When he was 16, he entered Detroit Business College. After his graduation, he accepted a clerkship at a hardware store in Pontiac and was employed by one firm from 1869 to 1880. He then experienced failing health and moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and worked in a hardware store there for 3 years while his health recovered. In 1883, he moved to Battle Creek and entered into a partnership with a man who had a store here. In 1894, he purchased his partner's interest in the store and continued to operate it as a sole proprietor. His hardware store, which was located on Main Street, grew to a prosperous business within the community. In 1880, he had married Miss Myra Satterlee in Pontiac, and they would go on to have 3 children. Mr. and Mrs. Pittman were well known in the city and enjoyed the hospitality of friendship with many homes over the years. Franklin was regarded within the community as a man who was successful in the control of his mercantile business and faithfully discharged his duty as a citizen within the city. He died at Nichols Hospital in July of 1923 at the age of 70. At that point, he had been a resident of the city of Battle Creek for 40 years. Charles Austin is the first biographical sketch and biographical review of Calhoun County, and his position in that book was not selected alphabetically, for there was a reason he was chosen to be first in this volume, as he is described as, "Few men are more prominent or widely known in the enterprising city of Battle Creek than the Honorable Charles Austin. He had been an important factor in business circles, and his popularity is well deserved, as in him are braced the characteristics of an unbending integrity, unabating energy, and an industry that never flags." Charles Austin was born in London, England, in April of 1834. In his early life, his father was a farmer, but he later turned his attention towards merchandising, where he opened a boot and shoe store in London. His father was also a minister of the Wesleyan denomination, and later in life would immigrate to New Zealand. There he would continue in his ministry and return to farming. Charles was educated in institutions of learning of the British and Foreign Schools Society, and his training in business was well received in his father's store. When he was a young man, he became interested in America. As he got older, believing reports that he would have more opportunity for business there, he sailed from London in 1852 and arrived in New York in February of that year. He was not yet 18 years old at the time, but he possessed a courageous spirit. Determined to succeed, he found his way to Albany, New York, and obtained a clerkship in a boot and shoe store there. In the fall of that year, he moved to Little Falls, New York for a short time, and then ultimately to Utica, where he would remain until 1854. It was in 1854 that he made his way to Michigan, ultimately settling in Concord until 1855. On January 1st, 1855, Mr. Austin married Miss Lucy D. Taylor while he was living in Concord, Michigan, and they would go on to become the parents of 5 sons. After that, he made his way to Calhoun County and initially settled in Homer. 2 years later, he moved to Bedford and opened a boot and shoe store there. Originally, his shop was strictly confined to these items, but with good business sense, he expanded to other merchandise. He continued his business in Bedford with a large patronage, but he ultimately moved his store to Battle Creek in 1872. From that time forward, his business career had grown to a uniform success, and he was soon numbered among the leading representatives of commercial interest in the city. While in Bedford, he was elected as a Justice of the Peace. He would also open a large dry goods store in Battle Creek and founded a large mercantile and commission house, which would become known as Godsmark, Durand and Company. It would grow into being the largest store in this section of the state during its time. He was also a stockholder and vice president and later president of the National Bank of Battle Creek, which became successful under his active management. He was elected as an alderman in 1875, and again in 1876, he was elected mayor, serving until 1880. His political life was just beginning, as he was then elected as a representative to the state legislature in 1882. In 1884, he was elected to the state senate. He was known to be an active working member in both houses, and most notably, he served on the Senate Committee on Railroads and was also on the Senate Committee on Finance. During his life, he was also an active Mason, having joined the organization in 1858. He and his wife were active members of the Independent Congregational Church, and he later served as a superintendent of the Sunday school. In 1869, he took a trip abroad, returning first to England to visit old acquaintances there from his boyhood days. He then went on to New Zealand and Australia, returning home 14 months later. He was always considered to be a broad-minded man and an honorable citizen in the community. Lucy Austin would pass away in 1913 from an abscess in her liver. The whole community grew to know Charles Austin in his later years as Uncle Charlie. He would pass away at his home in 1921 at the age of 88 from an apparent heart attack. He and Lucy are both buried at Oak Hill Cemetery.
So that's going to conclude today's journey through history here at Oak Hill Cemetery. It's raining on me. I've got the crying Mary here in the background. What could be better than that? But it's a nice warm summer day. So what's a little rain, huh? So if you enjoyed today's journey through history, please take a minute to hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, share the video with others, and be sure to check out my podcast called Tales of Southwest Michigan's Past, where I get to share a lot more stories that I don't always have time to bring to video form. So until next time, thanks for watching.